بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله حمد الشاكرين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد طب القلوب ودوائها ونور الأبصار وضيائها وعافية الأبدان وشفائها. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد كلما ذكرك الذاكرون وغافل عن ذكرك الغافلون. Today the subject is, broadly speaking, Sharia law, and then certain aspects of Sharia law, specifics of Sharia law, which people deem as important to be discussed in order to clarify. But before proceeding, I wanted to mention that many of these questions relating to Sharia law stem from a mindset, a post-colonial mindset, that indigenous and native people of countries in the East are unable to govern themselves. And if they govern themselves, they need a training in order to govern, like was stated recently by the son-in-law of Donald Trump, that the Palestinians need training to govern themselves. And now we live in a post-colonial age where countries are colonized through debt as well as a secular education. So relating to Sharia law specifically, because Sharia law was the last law that was dismantled by the colonial powers. You have to remember that the Ottoman Khilafah had a codified law which was known as Majallatul Ahkam, and the Mughal king, who is known as Alamgir Aurangzeb, he commissioned a book known as Al-Fatawa Al-Hindiya, which was a codification of law. Those books were compiled prior to colonialism. So any codification of law today is post-colonialism. So even the Constitution of Pakistan, which has its basis in 1935, was initially a colonial document, but then after the formation of Pakistan in 1947, into the 1950s, over a decade later, the Constitution of Pakistan was formulated, written down, and then went through different edits because in order to edit the constitution or modify the constitution, a 2/3 vote of parliament is essential. So any codification of law in the Muslim world we see today, whether it claims to be Islamic or not, is a post-colonial or neo-colonial document. Much of the Sharia law today would relate to personal law, like marriage and inheritance. But if we wanted to analyze Islamic law prior to the colonial period, we would have to analyze earlier books like Fatawa Alamgiri or Majallatul Ahkam, or even prior to that, even codification of economic rules, like Al-Imam Abu Yusuf, the student of Al-Imam Abu Hanifa. He had one of the earliest works on economy written, which is known as Kitab al-Kharaj. Likewise, his class fellow, Al-Imam Muhammad al-Shaybani, he wrote a work on foreign policy, which is known as Kitab al-Siyar. These books are available in Arabic, and for the Kitab al-Siyar, there is even an English translation available. So these were early codifications of Islamic law. Then the neo-colonialist mindset is affected in how a person would view law, would always be under the point of view of a Western education. So a person who may graduate from a madrasa, a seminary, religious seminary, would view law differently to someone who is educated like yourselves in a secular university. But Sharia law itself is different to laws of any indigenous population or tribal laws, like the tribal laws that existed in various countries across the world until the Anglosphere dominated most of the colored countries, meaning people with brown or dark skin, their countries were colonized and their indigenous laws were removed. But the difference between the Sharia law and those laws is that the Sharia law claims a divine source. This is one of the major differences, that the Sharia law is based on a divine source, that the Muslim claims that the Quran, which is the first source, primary source of Sharia, and the Sunnah, which is the prophetic way, which is the commentary to the Quran, these are the primary sources of Sharia law. The Muslim will claim that the source of these two is divine. So initially the discussion of Sharia law is a theological discussion, meaning whether someone wants to validate whether Sharia law is manageable and it is possible to implement Sharia law in any day and age. The inception of this discussion is theological, that if anyone is a believer in the revelation of the Quran and a believer in the prophetic way, they would deem Sharia law as a divinely revealed law. But after this, the reality is a believer, once he believes that the Sharia law is divinely revealed, he would not have any qualms with the divinely revealed laws. This is how the mindset of a believer should be. Meaning, like in Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the second chapter of the Quran, the longest chapter of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands the Jews who are wandering in the wilderness to sacrifice a cow. They are simply told to sacrifice a cow. The reason for behind the divine command of sacrificing the cow is not mentioned in the initial verses. So the wisdom behind the divine judgment is not mentioned. But later on in the verses, the wisdom behind the sacrifice of the cow is mentioned. But initially when they were commanded to sacrifice a cow, the wisdom is not mentioned. Why? Because when the believer reads this, it is sufficient wisdom that it is a divine judgment. That once a person has accepted and acknowledged that this is a divine judgment, then that is sufficient wisdom for the one who has accepted the Quran. So when there are laws in the Quran, if someone believes in the Quran, it is sufficient that this judgment is from the divine. Nevertheless, people will still question, and Islam never admitted blind following in faith, that when people did start questioning the wisdom behind different legal judgments, the fuqaha, who are the jurists, they compile books on what is known as Maqasid al-Sharia. The Maqasid al-Sharia is the objectives of the divine law. What are the objectives of the divine law? Because the divine law is revealed to safeguard our worldly and religious life. The Maqasid al-Sharia, the purpose of the Sharia, or the legislation of the Sharia, was to protect 5 things. One of them is human life. Additional to that is the faith. The first one is the faith, then human life, then human property, then human intellect and human lineage. All of these things are protected by the sanctioning of various ordinances which are found in the Sharia law. The word Sharia itself comes from Shariah. Shariah is a way and Sharia is a road in Arabic. Sharia is a law itself, meaning this law which Muslims believe has been revealed by God Almighty, protects not only our religious lifestyle, but it would also protect our economies, meaning fair distribution of wealth, that a proportion of the wealth is taken from the rich who reach a threshold of wealth, and that wealth is then redistributed amongst the poor, which is known as zakat, zakatul amwal. Likewise, the Sharia, aside from having an economic code, it has a military code, it has legal punishments. But in today's day and age, the Sharia law is vilified because it is viewed as Muslims as an alternative to secular law that governs most of the Muslim world today. That the alternative for Muslims is Sharia law. So the question then arises, who does Sharia law apply to? And this is one of the common misconceptions amongst non-Muslims. But before going into some what we would term as being misconceptions, sometimes there are no misconceptions, but people distort the actual law. Meaning, if someone objects to a ordinance of Sharia, they need to state the law correctly. Meaning, sometimes a person may choose something which is suitable for their argument, but they will not state the law correctly as it is stated in the codification of the books of jurisprudence. In the books of jurisprudence, if there is a law, that law must be stated correctly. So Sharia law, much of the Sharia law applies to Muslims. Meaning, non-Muslims that live in a country that is governed by Sharia law are less affected by the Sharia law. Meaning, once the non-Muslims, they pay what is known as jizya, a poll tax, they are largely unaffected by the Sharia law. They give something known which is known as a jizya, and the jizya then covers their rights to live as citizens in that country. They do not need to partake in military service, and they are protected, their religious rights are protected. When their religious rights are protected, many of the laws of Sharia do not apply to them. So even the Zoroastrians, at the time when the Muslims conquered Persia, many of them permitted in their religion incest, that a person was permitted to marry his own mother. When the Muslims conquered the land, the Muslims did not interfere in this law. Likewise, various other laws which were permitted in their religion, like drinking alcohol. Drinking alcohol does not affect non-Muslims, that if a non-Muslim drinks alcohol, he is not punished by Sharia law. So Sharia law largely affects Muslims, meaning Muslims who believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, believe this is a divinely revealed law. When they go to a qadi, a judge, the qadi will give a judgment in accordance with Sharia law. While non-Muslims, there are two options for the state. One is that the non-Muslims are permitted to set up courts in accordance with their own personal laws, or they have the option to go to the qadi, to the Islamic judge. And many times in Islamic history, the non-Muslims would approach the qadi for a fairer judgment. They would consider the Sharia law more fair than their own law. This happened many times. And sometimes, in the time of Imam Ali, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, the subjects are permitted to take even the head of state to court. So in the time of Imam Ali radiallahu anhu, a Jewish citizen of the Islamic Caliphate took Imam Ali radiallahu anhu to court, and Al-Qadi Shariah gave the judgment in favor of the Jew, meaning the Jewish subject of the state. He claimed that Imam Ali radiallahu anhu had taken his coat of arms or a shield, something of that nature, and the judgment was given in the favor of the Jew, but then the Jew admitted that he only did this to test the equity and fairness of the Islamic law. So, unlike, for instance, in the Pakistan constitution currently, the president cannot be convicted while he is president. The prime minister cannot be convicted while he is prime minister. Even in British law, the head of state, which is the Queen is not subject to many of the laws of the state. But in an Islamic Sharia law, the Caliph is subject to the law, that a citizen can take the Caliph to court. So Sharia law is applicable mainly to the Muslims. There are some laws which are common to all, like killing being forbidden, and this is a universal law. So Sharia law, one of the questions which was asked, who does it apply to? For the main part, it applies to Muslims. And Muslims are meaning a group of people who are known as Ahlul Halli wal Aqd, the people who can bind and the people who can unwind, unravel. This is a group of people who are able to form a caliphate, this group of people select a person who is known as Caliph, but the Caliph is not above the law. The Caliph is subject to the courts. If someone files a case against him, the Caliph will be summoned to the courts. After this, people question some of the punishments of the Islamic law. Because, of course, what people refer to as Islamic fundamentalism, even though the term fundamentalism is incorrect, because fundamental is someone who holds on to the fundamental of anything. That person would be known as a fundamentalist. But what we would refer to as al-ghulat or al-ghulu, which is extremists, that's like any law, the Sharia law can be subject to violations, where anyone who interprets the law, they can misinterpret some aspects of the law, and when they misinterpret or misunderstand some aspects of the law, they can violate some of the objectives of the Islamic law, as well as indiscriminately or in some cases wrongly carry out various punishments on people because they simply do not understand the Sharia law. This was the case with ISIS, a recent movement that sprung up on the borders of Iraq and Syria, and in Raqqa in Syria and in that region. I mean, the application of Sharia law was an application which was totally incorrect. So because of this, many of the people who interpret Sharia law, they or those people who are critics of Sharia law, they only are critics of the punishments found in Sharia law. So for instance, when you had a royal family which was of a Bedouin background, meaning the Saudi royal family, a family of Bedouin background, superimposed on the Arabian Peninsula in the early 1900s, after the demolition of the Islamic Caliphate. After the demolition of the Islamic Caliphate, a Bedouin family is superimposed on the Arabian Peninsula to govern the Arabian Peninsula. They were very selective of Sharia law. So they would place punishments on the citizens. Or for instance, the Bangladeshi, Indian and Pakistani workers or Yemeni workers that come from abroad, the Islamic law is applied to them. But the Islamic law is not applied to the royals. This is, again, incorrect interpretation of what actually Sharia law is. Likewise, the proliferation of riba interest, usually in the Arabian Peninsula, or anywhere else where people claim there is Sharia law, I mean, people are selective regarding what they deem as Sharia law. This happens in many other countries like Egypt and Jordan and other countries where the governments are very selective regarding what laws they will legislate. Now, if someone wanted an overview of all of Sharia law, they just need to read a book like Al-Mawardi's The Ordinances of Government, known as Al-Ahkam Sultaniya, which was commissioned by the Abbasi Caliphs. This book, in 20 chapters, summarizes all of Sharia law. This book was a book of governance which covers all the different aspects. Chapter number 19 is on punishments. So after chapter 1 in selecting a leader, the method of selecting a leader before modern Anglo-Saxon forms of democracy were superimposed on certain Muslim countries, or monarchies and dictators were superimposed on certain Muslim countries backed by the West, which claims to be an advocate of democracy. The method of selecting a leader is very well elucidated in works like Al-Ahkam Sultaniya. But then the chapters move on to having judges, different types of judges, then the system of economy, how wealth is acquired, how taxes are reduced, and personal wealth of people is increased, but how land is distributed, how farming and agriculture is increased, agrarian laws, and then after this, the zakatul amwal is taken, and then redistribution of wealth. After discussing all of these various things, as well as something which is known as the distribution of wealth, covers three major aspects. One is making sure that a body of wealth is distributed to the poor and needy. Secondly, the army is sustained for the defense of the lands of the Muslims. And the third is for the public welfare, that different things for the public good, like building roads and infrastructure and different things, are carried out with this distribution of wealth. After covering 18 chapters, when he reaches chapter 19, he covers criminal law. Meaning today people concentrate only on two things. One is women's hijab, and the other is criminal law. Meaning when they discuss Islamic law, they think that if Islamic law was superimposed in a country, only two things will change. One is all the women will be made to wear burqa, meaning the face veil, and the second is that people will be lashed on the roads. This is the image people have regarding Sharia law because of the implementation at the hands of ignorant people. Likewise, the lack of teaching amongst Muslim circles with regard to Sharia law. So, punishments is something of contention that people have. That why are different punishments carried out in Sharia law? One of them is the punishment of adultery. That someone, when they object, they will say, can you imagine in a modern state that when a punishment is carried out for adultery, that a person be stoned in a public area? And some of the images that we saw, dreadful images of ISIS, what they did is they would crucify people and place them on the road, and disregarding the fact that the first caliph, who was Sayyiduna Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, he prohibited the displaying of heads, severed heads in public areas. You'll find in a Sunan al-Kubra that the very first caliph of Islam prohibited this action, yet the ignorant people who claim to have superimposed Sharia law, they would display the decapitated heads of people or bodies on the roads and streets. So how do we reconcile this with the fact that the punishment for adultery is carried out with stoning? People will say this is a barbaric law or an outdated biblical law which has no room in the modern age. Firstly, when it comes to punishment, punishments are not related to whether they are outdated or outmoded ways of punishing. Punishments have been around from ancient times. So prison, for instance, is an outdated mode of punishment where people are placed in prisons. Even though it's an ancient way of punishing, it still is carried out today. Death penalty is the same. In America, when someone is electrocuted on the chair, an electric chair, no one or very few people would say this is barbaric, or the injection that is delivered to kill someone. So someone will say, how can you stone someone in the public? Firstly, the punishment of stoning, the conditions that are needed for stoning to be carried out are so stringent that it would be almost impossible for those conditions to be met. Like theft, meaning if you count the number of amputations that were carried out during the Caliphate, the true Caliphate, which was abolished just over 100 years ago, the number of hand amputations that were carried out were very few. So it is also almost impossible for the law to be carried out. In the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the law was carried out only 3 times, stoning. In all 3 cases, the person who had carried out adultery, who had committed adultery, came forward themselves in order to admit the sin. Meaning they wanted the law administered upon them. It was not the Prophet ﷺ seeking out people in order to see, spying on people, which is prohibited. Because the law itself states that if someone is witnessed doing adultery or fornication, the man and the woman, when they are carrying out this action, the penetration of the private organs must be seen and witnessed by 4 individuals. If any one of the account differs from the other, then those 4 people are punished. Meaning, where could you find this? Even if a person went to a qadi and they said they saw a man and a woman naked, committing that act, that would be insufficient evidence. and the person who brings such a case would be punished himself, meaning the very carrying out of the law is very difficult. So this law would firstly count as something which we would say is a violation of public modesty. So public modesty, that if someone decides to commit adultery in a public area openly, that the penetration of the private organs is witnessed by 4 people, this would be a violation of public order, and therefore the punishment is carried out. But very rarely, even in Western society, in America today, it is prohibited for women to show their nipples in public. And nudity is still prohibited even in many parts of the Western world, where people are claiming total freedom, that women are punished for this. So there are laws in the Islamic law, strict laws, in order to safeguard the family bond, that a person who is married, if he is caught carrying out an act of public obscenity to such a degree that 4 people can witness the penetration of the private organs, then the death penalty is carried out. Now someone will say, okay, we accept that this is very rarely found, and if it is, how can you allow and permit stoning of someone to death in public? The response is that a punishment can remain the same from age to age and time to time, but the packaging can change. Meaning a packaging of the bread that we consume today is the same bread that people consumed during the Roman period, but the packaging changes. Likewise, punishments. When punishments are carried out, the packaging of the punishment can change. What is meant by public arena? It does not mean that the city center becomes a place of stoning someone to death. It can be a private quarter of the government, an open compound, where only certain selected people from the public are invited to observe and witness the punishment. It doesn't mean that it needs to be open to the entire public. But secondly, and most vitally, a major point that is missed out when this punishment is mentioned, that if 4 witnesses observe the act of adultery being committed with total obscenity in public, and it is proven to a qadi, a judge, even when the punishment is carried out, if the people start stoning, and as soon as the stoning is administered, and the person decides to flee, because the person is not tied down, they decide to flee, the qadi, the judge, stops the punishment because a doubt has arisen. What is that doubt? That the person may be running away due to a certain reason, and therefore the qadi apprehends the person and a retrial is carried out. This is in fact from the guidance of the Prophet ﷺ, that in his lifetime a person was stoned after coming forward to be stoned himself, and the Prophet ﷺ carried out some checks regarding the sanity of the individual. When it was proven that the person was sane, when he ran away and the people chased him, the Prophet ﷺ condemned them for chasing after him, saying that maybe he would have refuted the claiming, saying that he did not carry out the act of adultery. So this punishment for adultery is one of the contested laws that people bring out regarding Sharia law. There was one additional question regarding forced marriage and divorce before we move on to the rights of women. Firstly, as the majority of the attendees here are from a Muslim background, they would know that in Sharia law, forced marriages are impermissible in Sharia. That even in the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, a young woman was forced to marry someone by her father. When this case was brought to the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, he had her separated from the man after talking to her, and she said, I was forced to marry the man. So forced marriages are impermissible in Sharia. When people carry this out as a cultural practice, if there was imposition of Sharia law in a country and a caliph, the caliph would prohibit such types of marriages and would separate those women who have been forced to marry men that they did not desire to marry. Additional to that is when we go into the rights of women, حقوق النساء, this question, of course, ties in with the rise of feminism in the Western world. That we had activists like Emily Pankhurst and others who were activists for the rights of women. When black men were given the right to vote, the feminist movement had its roots in a racist ideology where the women who were from an Anglo-Saxon background considered themselves superior to a black man and felt insulted that a black man would have the right to vote, but a woman from an Anglo-Saxon background would not be permitted to vote. So Western feminism has its roots in a racism that was prevalent and still is prevalent in the neo-colonialist world. But the objections brought forward regarding the rights of women in Islam. Firstly, you have divorce. One of the issues that is brought forward is regarding the right to divorce. Why is a Muslim woman not permitted to divorce? Meaning, why is the right given to the woman, to the man? The response is twofold. One is that the woman has the right to choose the dowry, and this is something women must know, Muslim women, that the woman has the right to choose the dowry. So if she if she chooses to have an expensive dowry, that is her right that the man must fulfill. So before marrying, if the woman says, my dowry is a house, the man must provide a house. If the woman says, my dowry is £50,000 or £100,000, the man must provide that dowry. Because of this right, the man is then given the right of divorce. But then people will say, if he provides the dowry and he has the right of divorce, in some cases the man may mistreat the woman, and therefore the woman would want to separate, but she is not permitted to do so. Of course, in Islam there is a law known as khul'a, where the woman applies for a divorce from the man, giving back some of the dowry or all the dowry, and then a khul'a, a separation, is carried out. But even in that case, if the man does not accept, what does a woman do? In that case, there are two options. One option is that there are numerous reasons as to why a woman is separated from a man. Like madness. If a man is mad, he loses his sanity, that man is separated from the woman. Likewise, if the man, he has impotence, he is separated from the woman. If you look at the books of verdicts, fatwa, you will find a long list of reasons why a man is separated from a woman. But there is something which is overlooked by people today. That is that at the time of the nikah, the woman has a choice. She can write down in the contract of nikah that I have the power to divorce. At the time of nikah, the woman has the right to write down, I have the power to divorce. So once the nikah is carried out, the woman has the power to divorce also. So this issue is not a major issue as people make it out to be. And rather this comes down to ignorance of what the actual Islamic law is. Additional aspect of women's rights relate to inheritance. What is commonly quoted regarding inheritance of women, that when you have a case of siblings, a man and a woman, the brother receives double inheritance of the sister. This is commonly quoted. How as Muslims do we respond to this? Firstly, Surah An-Nisa was revealed at a time when women were not given any rights at all. So the entire chapter related to inheritance laws. So it would be incorrect for someone to say that Islam curtails the rights of women in terms of inheritance. But in all cases of inheritance, is it true that women receive half the inheritance of men? The answer is no. There are cases where a woman would receive 1/3 of the inheritance, or 1/4 of the inheritance, or 1/8 of the inheritance, or all of the inheritance. Likewise, there are different fractions which are mentioned in the Quran. It is one case scenario where the siblings, the inheritance is divided, that the sister will receive half the inheritance of the male. Why is this the case? The reason is that firstly for Muslims, like I mentioned at the beginning, it's sufficient that it is the divine law. But people would want to know the divine wisdom behind the law. The answer is that when the sister receives her inheritance and she needs to marry, she receives the dowry of her choice. Additional to that, the maintenance is left to the man. The man must pay for her house, her dwelling, to the quality and standard that she lived in with her parents. I mean, the quality and standard she had with her parents. The man must maintain that. And the man pays for all the expenses of the marriage. Because the expenses of the man are more than the expenses of a woman, the brother receives double inheritance of the sister, because the brother will have more expenses later when he marries. The sister, when she marries, she will not need to worry about her dowry. She can demand as much dowry as she wants. Likewise, if she works, when she works, the money she earns, she does not have to contribute to the household. That is the task of the man. Now, what happened recently, some people brought to me a case that a man and a woman here in England were living together, and throughout the marriage, the woman, she would say to the man, equal rights, equal rights. So, meaning whenever she needed something, she would say equal rights. At the end, the man became so frustrated that he said, I paid £80,000 for the house, meaning the first installment of the mortgage. Give me £40,000 back, equal rights. When they went to shop, the man said to the woman, you pay for half the bill. You pay for half the bill, because they both worked. Whenever bills would arrive in the house, he made her pay half, saying equal rights. At the end, the woman said, no, Islam is correct, meaning the man must maintain the household. Meaning, does this mean there is an infringement on the rights of women? The answer is no. There are different roles for men and different roles for women. Meaning, in Islam, what we recognize is the role of a man is to provide, and the role of a woman is to look after the household. If someone objects, then if we do apply equal rights in its true sense, not selectively, then many households would suffer with this claim of equal rights in terms of earnings. So of course, in Islam, we've never had the issue of women being permitted to work. Sayyidah Khadija radiallahu anha was a tradeswoman, a merchant. Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, one of the people he placed in charge of the marketplaces, was a woman. Likewise, women have the right to be part of government administration, meaning these things have never been an issue in the Muslim world. But there is an objection regarding leadership. Why can a woman not be head of state? There is a law in Islamic law that the Caliph must be a man. So people say, why is this? Meaning there's an objection. Even though they will overlook the fact that the US, America, has never had a female president. And for a reason. Meaning no one would say regarding the Americans that they curtail the rights of women. Only Muslims become targets of this objection. Like when the Americans, they took over Afghanistan, they wanted the parliament to be 50% women, even though British and American, the British Parliament and American Senate is not 50% women, but superimpose that on the Muslims. Nevertheless, in Islamic law, the women can be a part of the governance of different governmental bodies, but the Caliph must be a man. So the question is, why is a Caliph a man? The answer is simple, because the Caliph, the role of the Caliph involves dealing with men and not normal men, dealing with the military. So head of military, they're meeting the chief of army staff, and intermingling with men to such a degree that it is an inappropriate role for a woman. This is the only reason. It is not because the woman is incapable intellectually, but then additional to this, people will say, why in Islamic law, and this issue became a big issue in Pakistan in the 1980s, that why is the witnessing of a woman considered half of the witnessing of a man? This is a common question, meaning in court. If you go to court, why does the witnessing of a woman count as half the witnessing of a man? Is this correct? The answer is no. Like I mentioned earlier, if people quote the law correctly, then many of the misconceptions will be removed. What is that law? The correct interpretation of that law is when those issues which relate to women, those issues, the witnessing of a woman is sufficient and the witnessing of a man is rejected. When those issues which relate to women, in those issues, the witnessing of a woman is sufficient and the witnessing of a man is thrown out of court. But there are certain circumstances where the witnessing of a woman counts as half of the witnessing of a man. Not always, in certain cases, like in trade. Why in trade? Because even in the stock market, if you go today to New York and you go to NASDAQ and observe the stock market, you will notice all the people present, most of the people will be men. So because of this, in trade, the witnessing of a man counts as double as that of a woman. But not in all cases. In some cases, the witnessing of a woman is sufficient and the witnessing of a man is discounted. It is thrown out of court, like in marriage and in a few other things, suckling and a few other things which are mentioned in the books of Sharia. So this is not always the case. What happened in Pakistan was that the women's rights groups, they protested against this law. But because in Pakistan you have a polarization of clerics who are unable sometimes to even eloquently explain the Islamic law, at that time there was a polarization between the clerics and the public. But then when the law was correctly explained, the protests finished. Likewise, the law relating to blood money, that if a man is killed, there is a certain amount of blood money that is given. But when a woman is killed by accident, meaning a fatal accident or accidental death, half the blood money is that of a woman. Meaning the blood money of a woman is half of that of a man. So people protested against this law, saying that the value of a woman is less than the value of a man in Islam. But is this correct? Again, if they had only understood the law. The purpose of the law was that when a man dies, because a man is the breadwinner of the family, the money is doubled and the money is given to the wife of the man. Who inherits? The wife of the man is given the money. When a woman dies, because the man is not living off the provision of the woman, he receives only half of that blood money. It's not because the value of the life is less, it's because of the provision that the man provided. A simple thing, yet people made an issue of this in Pakistan also in the 1980s, meaning where you have secular people polarized from the clerics in Pakistan who are in some cases uneducated with regard to Western law. So because of this, there is a complete polarization between secular educated people and those who are graduates from madrasas. So these are some of the issues relating to Sharia law, and what was specifically as was regarding the marriage of Sayyidatuna Aisha radiallahu anha. Now, the objection to the marriage of Sayyidatuna Aisha radiallahu anha was never found prior to the 1900s. The first objection to her marriage was found after the 1900s. So we would have to ask, why did this objection not exist prior? The answer is, anyone who studies anthropology, and you are in a secular university, you must have an anthropologist professor somewhere, you ask them that when you study cultures in anthropology, the standards of that culture are not you do not take the standards of the modern age and superimpose the standards of the modern age on a previous ancient culture. You do not judge an ancient culture in the standards of the modern age. This goes against the study of anthropology. So why was the objection to the marriage of Aisha radiallahu anha brought up only after the 1900s? The answer is very simple. Because in terms of international law in that time, women were regarded as women once they passed the age of puberty. This is a simple answer. Meaning, boys were considered men once they passed the age of puberty, and women were regarded as women once they passed the age of puberty. So girls who were 9 years old at the time were not considered as young girls, but were considered women. If this was not the case, then in Arabian customs at the time, when the Prophet ﷺ married Aisha radiallahu anha, the pagans would have objected to the marriage to Aisha radiallahu anha, but they did not. Why? Because Aisha radiallahu anha was considered a woman and not a child, an underage child. Meaning what people term today as pedophilia. Pedophilia today would be defined as marrying someone who is a minor or underage. The age of consent today in Britain is 16, in Britain, 16 with the consent of parents and 18 without the consent of parents. In international law at that time, the woman was considered a woman at the age of 9. Why has this changed? This has changed with time because of the mental age of the children today. Meaning, in that time, the women were so advanced living in a Bedouin society that the young girls at a young age were able to adapt themselves so quickly that mentally they were women at the age of 9. Now the age itself is contested. The age of itself, even though in Bukhari the age 9 is mentioned very clearly. But remember, the ages, when they state age in that time, there is a companion of the Prophet, peace be upon him, who says he would lead his tribe in prayer when he was 7 years old. But the meaning is not 7, because we know a 7-year-old is not permitted to lead the prayer. What they would do is that there was a certain number of years that when a person would reach those years, they would count the years from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 7 plus 10 is 17. 9 plus 10 is 19. What the Jews do is when a child reaches the age of maturity, they also have this practice. They start counting the years of the person from that age, which is the age of puberty. So if someone counts the age from 9 of a girl, from the age of 9, if you add 9, it would make the age 18. If you add for a boy, if the boy reaches puberty at the age of 15, you add 7, the age would be 22. This was the method of counting. And some of them would not have, remember they had no birth certificates in those times, so they would estimate the age. So this is why many people now, of course, people like Tommy Robinson or other ignorances or people in the EDL or these type of groups latch onto this subject because of equating the Prophet of Islam, equating him, waliyadu billah, with the gangs, the pedophile gangs that we have in the UK. When in reality this is just done in order to discredit the religion of Islam. So the simple answer is that this objection has only arisen after post-1900s. This objection did not arise before. Does Islam sanction child marriage? The answer is no. That the marriage is carried out with the consent of the woman after she reaches the age of maturity. The age of maturity now can be redefined in accordance with modern standards because of the way of living, that in the Muslim world the age of maturity would be 16 or 18 as it is in Pakistan. In Pakistan the age of consent now is 18 in Pakistan. In Yemen the age of consent was only raised recently. So this shows that this practice has been continuing for hundreds of years, where young girls were considered women once they passed the age of puberty. Now, there are many other issues that can be covered, but I will finish here. And inshallah, we will open up for questions and answers. The people in the audience, they can stand up and ask their questions, or they can write down their questions. Do you have a mic to pass around? Yeah.
I have a question regarding apostasy. I don't know if you have read the paper by Dr. Jonathan A.C. Brown, but in his paper he had some conclusive remarks towards the end where he said that the hakim should use his right to not carry out executions and punishments, and he should use that in this day and age in order to preserve the status of the Muslims, or just the image of the Muslims in general. I don't recall it exactly, but if you've read the paper, what are your thoughts on that?
I haven't read such a paper, but the murtad law is equated today with the law of treason. And the murtad law only applies on a male. So if a woman or a child decides to leave the religion of Islam in a Muslim community under Islamic law, the had punishment is applied upon only the male, meaning if someone who has reached maturity, has sanity. And even then there is a time period given in the Hanafi school where the person, where the hakim, the ruler, decides whether the punishment should be carried out, taking certain things into account. The main reason behind the law is that the law is a political law religiously sanctioned by the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, but is due to the safeguarding of the Muslims. Now, what is mentioned by some of the scholars that the ruling is left to the discretion of the hakim whether the person is a political threat. Otherwise, the person is imprisoned indefinitely, pending the punishment. I mean, it's not a cancellation of the punishment because no one can carry out naskh, abrogation. So the law applies, but a waiting period can be applied in discretion, with the discretion of the hakim.
Any more questions?
One question that we have is, will non-Muslims go to hell when Allah has created them as non-Muslims?
Of course, it's a common objection. Firstly, every human being is created with free will. So the choice of religion is once a person reaches the age of maturity, has intellect, free will, they make the choice of believing or disbelieving. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not make them disbelievers. Now someone will say that a person was born in a non-Muslim family and therefore has no choice. The answer is the Quran states, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. We will not punish a people until we send a messenger. So if the message of Islam reaches them and they have intellect and freedom of choice and comprehension, meaning there are 10 conditions which are mentioned, then they make the choice of disbelieving and are not forced into disbelief. As for different different considerations in terms of family background, social background, all these different considerations, these are taken into account by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the individual. Meaning, individual judgment is left to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Question number 2. In countries such as Pakistan, people take law into their own hands in the UK, how should we as Muslims react if someone disrespects the Prophet ﷺ in front of us?
Taking the law into your own hands is prohibited. So if someone does take the law into their own hands, they would be punished by the hakim, the ruler. So in Pakistan, if someone decides to take the law into their own hands, they are left to being punished by the law. The law applies to them. There is a discretionary punishment. The person can be imprisoned. Of course, if the person takes the law into their own hands and they carry out a punishment against someone who was guilty, then the ruler can carry out a discretionary punishment upon them for taking the law into their own hands, like imprisoning them or fining them. And in the UK, it would be obviously absurd and prohibited for any Muslim to apply Sharia law, because the individual does not apply Sharia law on others. The Sharia law is applied in the Muslim world by the ruler, not by the individual. So applying the law individually is totally prohibited.
I think Buddha has a question of the audience, just behind the
Salam Sheikh. On your recent talk a few days ago on Medina State, Pakistan, you beautifully highlighted how Islam, if it was implemented correctly, would actually be able to undo a lot of the constraints placed in Pakistan by the colonialists. However, the arrival of legitimate groups, which you touched on before, such as ISIS, has actually led to a lot of misconceptions about Islam's view on politics, especially with the concept of Caliphate. The question is, what is the Caliphate and does it actually have a role to play in Islam?
Again, the Caliphate is a governing body which was inherited from the Prophet ﷺ. It's a communal obligation on the Muslim nations today to re-establish such a governing body. And as I mentioned, that the governance of this body covers 20 areas of law which are mentioned by Al-Mawardi in Al-Ahkam Sultaniya. How we counter an extremist interpretation of Sharia is by going back to the books of law of Sharia. Meaning, if someone goes back to the Islamic books of law, they will realize that the Sharia law is not extreme. So one starting point is the book Al-Ahkam Sultaniya, which is translated as the Ordinances of Government. You can find this book in English. The author is Al-Mawardi.
Allah forgives all sins except shirk. So why will Iblis go to hell, as he has seen Allah and he knows Allah is the creator of everything?
I think the person intends to ask that Shaitan has not committed shirk. The response is, the word shirk is used in the verse of the Quran in order to entail disbelief. Meaning, from all the forms of disbelief, the greatest form of disbelief is shirk. So the verse states that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives everything except shirk. Meaning shirk here entails disbelief. Like the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would sometimes say, Al-Hajj Arafah. That Hajj is Arafah. But Hajj is not limited to Arafah. There are other rites and actions which are performed in Hajj. But Arafah is one of the major ones. So shirk is mentioned, but what is meant by shirk is disbelief. So Shaitan is not free from disbelief.
Okay, in Islam, is it right to take out student finance, i.e. maintenance loan? And if so, is zakat farz on that student maintenance? And additionally, can I travel to Umrah or Hajj with that loan money?
You see, what's prohibited is not a loan in itself. What is prohibited is interest and paying back interest on the loan. So if you can attain a loan without interest, that would be permitted. Now, whether you take a loan with interest or without interest, the payment of interest is sinful, but the person would still have to pay zakat if they keep the savings of that loan, and they are permitted to perform Hajj and Umrah with that money. What's prohibited is paying back interest. That's prohibited.
There are some cards going around, so sisters, if you could be quick as possible, inshallah, we'll answer your questions as well.
Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh. As I'm sure you're aware, there's the hadith where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he mentions that the Ummah will divide into 73 sects, and that 72 will go to the hellfire and one will go to Jannah. I just wanted to ask, are the other 72 sects, are they considered Muslims or kafir or misguided, and will they eventually go to Jannah, or is it just a one sect?
With regard to the hadith on 73 sects, there are numerous interpretations scholars have given, but the best interpretation given is that, firstly, that the Jews divided into 71 sects, the Christians divided into 72 sects, and the Prophet ﷺ said, "Sataftariqu ummati, my nation shall divide into 73 sects." What the scholars say, the Ummah here meant is the people that the Prophet ﷺ calls out to Islam. Meaning all the nations of the world that are called to Islam, this is known as Ummatul Da'wah. Ummatul Da'wah, the nation that shall be called to Islam. Those who accept the call of the Prophet ﷺ and stick to the essential teachings of Islam, which are known as ma'lum fi din bil darura, essential teachings of Islam, are those who will enter paradise, and those who reject the message or they deny essential aspects of Islam, those are the groups that will go to hellfire.
Will Islamic governing bodies be punished for their silence on the matters such as Chinese constitution?
Of course, every government is liable for responsibility in speaking against all the injustice that is occurring in China, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is punishing them by other means, meaning the Chinese government. But the Muslim world currently is constrained by debt, and like I mentioned, neo-colonialism entails that the Western Anglosphere does no longer needs to invade countries. They hold them to account by the IMF loans and by plundering their minerals. So many of the countries are not speaking up because they think that they are unable to do so. So this needs, internally, the Muslim world needs a reconstruction of the way the thinking is occurring in the Muslim world as well as governance.
Interesting one. What does Islam say about caste marriages? Any marrying a certain caste or something?
Marrying according to rejecting a suitor due to caste is impermissible.
If a Muslim commits suicide, do they go to hellfire?
Again, suicide is considered a sin. They may be punished for the sin, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may forgive them. Because sometimes some people who do suicide could be suffering from mental illness. So the only one who's liable is the one who is not suffering from mental illness.
A widow has three children. A widow has children who do not help her except her daughter. She wants to leave everything with her. What do you say about this?
She is permitted to leave 1/3 of her wealth with whom she wants, 1/3. After this, the 2/3 are redistributed in accordance with the laws of inheritance.
You mentioned that women do not have to pay towards the expenses at home. However, what happens or what do they do when the man is incapable to pay and she is forced to contribute?
And this would fall under the scenarios I mentioned regarding separation. Faskhul nikah, where the nikah could be invalidated because the man cannot keep up maintenance. Maintenance is one of the obligations of the man.
A child from a Muslim's family decides when he's old enough that he wants to leave Islam and become a Christian. Why would he be killed because he did not choose to be a Muslim? And it goes against the words. It goes against the words that there is no compulsion of religion. Does God like to punish people knowing that they don't have a choice?
Again, if a child becomes a Christian, there is no punishment, and it does not contradict the verse, because once he becomes an adult, he has the option to become a Christian, but without voicing his Christianity. Meaning, essentially, it's not essential necessary for him to go around saying to everyone, I've left Islam, I've become a Christian, especially if he is married, because once he is married, the nikah is invalidated. But the main reason is that the person has the option to leave the Muslim country and announce his Christianity elsewhere. Like the Saudi, a woman who left Saudi Arabia, decided to leave Islam, and she left Islam, meaning there's no problem. She's left Islam, that's her choice. But unfortunately, the mindset that we are dealing with, the first thing she does when she leaves is place a picture online with the legs showing and eating pork. As if to say eating pork and showing the legs is the reason why you leave your religion. Meaning, is this the level of intelligence that we have? It's like some people when they think that if a woman in a miniskirt is more intelligent than a woman in a burqa or a niqab. Meaning, what are the criteria of judging intelligence? So, if a woman or a child decides to leave Islam once they reach adulthood, they have the freedom of leaving the Muslim country. But in majority states today in the Muslim world, many people leave Islam. Meaning in Saudi Arabia, people leave Islam. In Pakistan, people leave Islam. A majority of them are not punished by those countries.
Must the Imam have the intention of praying with women, i.e. in congregation?
When the Imam leads the Salah, he must intend to lead the women also, in order to validate their Salah.
Any brothers and sisters have any questions?
I'll go to the back first.
Salam Shaykh. Obviously we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all seeing and all hearing among many other things. So because of this belief, do we affirm that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has senses, even if the kayfiyah of those senses is different from human senses?
When we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is as-Sami' al-Basir, as-Sami' al-Basir, if you say sensory perception entails looking at colors and images with the eyes, and with the ears it would entail hearing sound waves. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His divine hearing transcends sound waves. So we say in the books of Kalam, we read in the books of Kalam, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has images, but the human being does not hear images, meaning his hearing transcends what we know as sensory perception.
Obviously nowadays we've got stuff like DNA evidence and fingerprints like the instead of eyewitnesses.
The answer is DNA and fingerprints and all these modern ways of investigating crime are permitted in Sharia to carry out discretionary punishment. They are not permitted to carry out hudud. So someone commits adultery. The adultery, firstly, a case of adultery being proven through DNA would not happen, except in rape. If there is a case of rape brought to the qadi, the 4 witnesses are unavailable. When the 4 witnesses are unavailable, the 4 witnesses being unavailable would not entail that the rapist is not punished. The rapist is punished if there is DNA evidence and the 4 witnesses available, there's no admittance on his part, of the rapist's part, then the qadi can indefinitely imprison the person. But with discretionary law, death penalty is not permitted. Death penalty is only carried out in 3 cases in Sharia law. In any other case, death penalty is not permitted. Lashing is only limited. It's very limited. So discretionary punishment can be carried out using other forms of evidence.
In Islamic belief, we obviously reject tajsim, and that is proven through aql and naql. But however, often people attribute these mujassima statements to scholars, and one of the books that deals with that is what is it called? Asadatul Hanabila Ma'a Salafiyat al-Mu'asira by Sheikh Mustafa Hamdu. But how do we respond to other books such as Ijtima'u al-Juyush al-Islamiyya ala Harb al-Mu'attila wal-Jahmiyya by Ibn Qayyim? Because those seem to be very convincing references that he provides.
Any one of the works of Ahmad bin Taymiyyah or Ibn Qayyim, the references always need to be double-checked. Meaning, those books were written in the 8th century of Islam. So they are not from the sources of the Salaf al-Salihun. So most of the references, like the work Ijtima' al-Juyush al-Islamiyya, most of the references need to be checked. Addition to that, some of the statements that are ascribed to the Salaf, even when we acknowledge the statements, those statements are interpreted by both groups. For instance, some of the earlier Muslims, they would say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would ascribe to him al-fawqiyah, a loftiness. When those statements are brought to the Sunni scholars, they say this loftiness entails al-fawqiyatul mutlaqa, unrestricted loftiness. Meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is lofty in every sense. But when the same statement is brought to the Taymiyyah school, they would interpret al-fawqiyah as being al-fawqiyatul hissiyah, sensory loftiness. That God is located in a place which is above the heavens. So it's interpretation of those statements. Now why did the Salaf make such statements? After we negate the inauthentic statements, the authentic statements, this was a response to the Jahmiyyah. The Jahmiyyah were an early sect that rejected all the ahadith of the sifat, what we refer to as ahadith al-sifat al-khabariyah. They rejected all these reports, so the Salaf would make statements saying, our God descends how He wishes, how He wills. But they were not affirming tajsim for Allah. They were affirming the reports that were reported. And like an example, Al-Imam Muhammad bin Idris al-Shafi'i rahimahullah said, Amirruha ala zahiriha. Pass the reports on their apparent. The Taymiyyah school states the apparent here means the apparent wording, the apparent meaning. But the Sunni school says the apparent wording. That what Imam al-Shafi'i is saying, when the hadiths are narrated, pass them by on the words that they were narrated with. Not the apparent meaning, but again they interpret this as being apparent meaning. So if a hadith states God descends to the lowest heaven, the Taymiyyah school would say this is apparent on its meaning. The Sunni school would say this is the wording of the hadith, but God does not descend the way creatures descend. So this is how you make a distinction between the two.
The Quran says that men can hit women to discipline them. Is this not promoting domestic violence?
Okay, with this verse, firstly, the verse does not say that men are permitted to hit women. It's referring to a case known as nashiza. The case is known as nashiza. That a man has three options with a woman. The third option, it mentions striking. It mentions striking, the word striking is mentioned. Striking, what's meant by striking is, Ibn Abbas states that if the man has a miswak and he does this to the woman with the miswak, that's permitted. Now this is the point of contention. But the answer is that the woman is permitted to have the man beaten also. Many people are unaware of this. But the question is, why is it not stated in the Quran as such? The answer is because the woman takes the case to the Qadi. The Qadi administers a beating to the man. Why is the woman not permitted to hit the man directly? Because some men are insane and stronger than women, that if the woman attempts to hit the man will be violent with the woman. So in an Islamic governed state, if the man, for instance, it was mentioned there's a drunken husband, he drinks every day, he comes to the house, this is a nashiza, he comes drunk, he refuses to earn, he refuses to look after the children. The woman goes to the local qadi, she says, my husband is nashiz. The qadi will call him and will say, you must behave. If he's given reprimands, if he does not improve, the qadi then administers the beating for the man. Is that clear? So it's not a one-way system. The striking for the woman is only that the man has a miswak and he does this. If he does anything more, the woman takes him to the qadi, the police, and then the police will administer that beating to the man.
Right, the next question, is if someone performs black magic and goes to Hajj or Umrah later, will their Hajj or Umrah be accepted?
They would need to repent from the black magic, which is kufr, and then once they repent and undo the black magic, they can do Hajj and Umrah.
Is it permissible to break ties with a family member due to knowing they have performed black magic?
Whether someone has done black magic or not, a person needs certainty, and in most cases that certainty is never established, so therefore it would be impermitted to break ties with them.
Can an unmarried woman live in her own house because she can't stay with her parents forever?
Yes, she is permitted to live in her own house, but most women and men should marry at a young age. So many university students do not get married. They should perform nikah at a young age. Do not delay the nikah. Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu said 3 things should not be delayed. One of them was a young woman who is able to marry and is not married. So people should marry young. There's a new trend now where people delay the marriage, they perform haram before the marriage, and then by the time some women and men, they reach the late 30s and they are not married. Remember, with the women, the younger the age, the more the demand for the woman. As the woman grows old, the demand decreases for that woman. With a man, the younger he is, the demand is less. As he grows, his wealth increases. With his wealth increasing, the demand his wealth increasing and his hair going bald, meaning his head going bald, the demand will increase. So young women should marry at an early age. This is something Islam recommends.
Okay, if a woman is raped, is she allowed to abort the child, i.e. have an abortion?
Yes, this is permitted in Islam. The rape victim is allowed to abort the child in the early stages.
When the Prophet ﷺ said, no Muslim dies on the day of Friday except that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protects him from the trials of the grave. Does this apply to Muslims or just practicing Muslims?
What is this term practicing Muslim? Every Muslim is practicing. Some are practicing less and some are practicing more. Yes? Meaning if you grow a beard, it doesn't make you a practicing Muslim. A beard does not make you a practicing Muslim. Some men think that the beard alone makes them practicing Muslims, or the hijab. It doesn't make you a practicing Muslim. The practice of Islam is more deep. Meaning if someone has a beard and they disrespect their parents, the beard is less of an importance than respecting the parents. There may be a Muslim who's clean shaven and he respects his parents. He's less of a sinner than the man who has a full beard and disrespects his parents. So this prioritizing, so the answer to the question is it applies to all Muslims. But this term practicing and non-practicing is something subjective, meaning all Muslims would be considered practicing. Do not base it on the appearance. The appearance doesn't mean anything.
What is the difference between Ashari and Maturi?
Again, this is just relates to the location of 2 schools that expand in Sunni creed. The name only they only differ in 6 points of finer theological points, which are beyond the discussion today.
Is it permissible to use DNA evidence in Sharia court rather than having an eyewitness? The last question is, which is very good, and it's a question that sums everything up. Which books would you recommend to young Muslim students at university to read, which will not only increase our Islamic knowledge, but also improve our Islamic awareness around the world?
Okay, there are a few books like this. One book, as I mentioned, was Al-Mawardi's The Ordinances of Government by Al-Mawardi, which is in English. Another book is Sharia Law by Abdul Rahman I. Doi. I, the letter I, and Doi, D-O-I. The Sharia Law. This is an excellent book to read. There are other books as well, additional to that, depending on what the person would want to increase their knowledge on. But those two books, I think, on Sharia law are sufficient. If you read those two, they are sufficient.
Last question. Can we call for Sharia law in the UK, which is also applicable on non-Muslims? Because the Prophet ﷺ was in Mecca amongst the Quraysh, yet the kuffar, yet he still preached them, i.e. he wanted them to accept Islam. However,
firstly, the Sharia law was not established in Makkah al-Mukarramah as a law of governance. The disbelievers were called to the faith. So in this country, we call people to faith, but we cannot impose our religion upon them. And likewise, the Sharia law is a law of governance for Muslims to establish in what is known as Darul Islam. So of course in the 90s and prior to 9/11, there was a rising tide amongst some groups in London, like the followers of Umar al-Bakri and others, that called for Sharia law in the Western world, which was an imbecilic call which has no basis in the Sharia. What we call people to here is to Islam, and not necessarily to practice Sharia law in this country. Sharia law is to be established in Darul Islam, in the Muslim world.